Welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. Alec Baldwin says his Rust contract makes him judgment-proof on the fatal shooting of Halyna Hutchins, the cinematographer on the movie set. He's actually blaming her for the incident. Baldwin's lawyers filing an arbitration claim. To dive a little bit deeper into what this all means, I want to bring in legal analyst Nicole DeBoard. Nicole, thanks for joining us on this Friday evening.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so arbitration claim. Explain why they're doing this and what happens next.
So the contract itself can provide a mandatory arbitration clause. In other words, what can happen is that in a civil lawsuit, or before you have a civil lawsuit, all claims must be vetted via arbitration. Sometimes we sign such an agreement when we enter into other contracts, say with a credit card company. You'll read these very long contracts that you sign, and there's usually an arbitration clause in them. And so what he is saying is that his contract had such an arbitration clause, and that any disputes that arose out of his work on the film would have to be handled in arbitration instead of in a courtroom.
So they're saying that he has no financial responsibility when it comes to what happened.
That is what he is arguing, and he's explaining in his request for an arbitration and his documentation that he should not be held responsible because none of his actions could have been reasonably predicted to cause the death of Miss Hutchins.
Okay, and we're also learning that they're saying legal fees even should be covered by production instead. So we're seeing this kind of shift in blame from Baldwin to production.
It's such an interesting case when you look at it from just the academic facts. It's obviously such a tragic personal story. But from a legal perspective, you have a situation where it is clear that Alec Baldwin fired this gun, and that gun caused the death of Hutchins. But it's an unusual circumstance because there never should have been live ammunition in a gun which was on a set. And so he's saying, essentially, you know, look, I could not have reasonably expected that any of these firearms, which should have been used as props, would have had ammunition in them, which could have resulted in killing anyone. And that is a dangerously reasonable claim if you're the Hutchins, because it is something that would make sense if you're looking at a movie set. No one would expect to be shooting live firearms as part of the production of a movie.
Yeah, they go on to say that she actually handed it to him, was telling him where to hold it, how high to hold it, where to point and whatnot. Is this a good strategy from the legal team of Alec Baldwin? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Again, it's such a sad and tragic and devastating case. And so anytime you argue something, like the person who is ultimately the victim of the tragedy is to blame, you're treading on thin ice because it can cause a negative reaction in the person ultimately deciding the facts. But if you look at it from a purely academic standpoint and from a legal standpoint, it is a valid defense, if you will, to this lawsuit, because he is saying, look, this is the person who handed me the weapon. There was no reason to believe that it was a dangerous firearm or that it contained a live round. And there's nothing that he could have or should have done differently under those circumstances because of the way she handed him the firearm and the instructions that she gave him. So that's what he is saying. Look, I don't think it's an effort to discount the tragedy. What I think it is to explain the situation in legal terms and why he is not legally responsible and should not be held civilly responsible for this death.
Well, Matthew Hutchins is the husband of Halyna Hutchins, the woman who lost her life. Him and several other people are filing wrongful death lawsuits. If you're building a case against Baldwin, how do you proceed?
If you're building a case against Baldwin, what you should do is go to look at the policies and procedures for how weapons and the armory should have been handled on the set. And you're looking for any deviations in what he did as opposed to what the policy for that production called for. Was there a time when he should have asked, is this firearm safe? Is there some sort of double checking that should have gone on that involved Baldwin in the moments leading up to the shooting? That is where they should be focusing their energy.
Yeah, and we're hearing that really he was just a creative EP, so possibly there are people above him that the blame could end up being shifted to. What do you foresee as the future of this case? What are your predictions? It's hard to say, no crystal ball here, but with all of the information that's come in.
Sure. I mean, and again, no crystal ball, like you've pointed out, and we don't really have every detail, as shocking as that may seem, since we've had access to so much information, including an interview from Baldwin in this case. It's still very unpredictable to know how it will come out. The reality is that I think that there's a fair chance that an arbitrator or ultimately a jury could decide that he did not have reason to believe that this was a live firearm and so should not be held accountable either civilly or ultimately criminally.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. Let's talk about that interview for a moment, because he has stood his ground and said that he does not accept liability for all of this, shifting liability to people who were on the set. You know, was that a good choice on his part to sit down with ABC News and say that on live television?
I don't have issue with anything necessarily that he said. Of course, I don't have all of the information that the investigators who are investigating this case have. And so saying that I'm not liable is not necessarily the problem. What could be the problem is if the forensic examiners who are looking at the ballistics and who are looking at the other physical evidence from the scene find anything at all that contradicts something that he said in that interview, that could be a huge problem for him, not only civilly, but potentially criminally if they decide to file charges on him.
Right. He also brought in the human aspect of it, because him and Halyna Hutchins and a few other of the crew members had worked on previous sets together, and said that Matthew Hutchins, the husband, had told him, we're in this together, essentially. So could that work in Alec Baldwin's favor as well, bring in those aspects of the case?
It's possible that it can. Ultimately, it may be something that an arbitrator would consider in terms of what are the motivations for seeking this particular defendant in a civil suit because he has money. Maybe that's why they're looking to try to sue him to get that money, whereas other people might not have the funds that could ultimately satisfy a judgment in this case. So I think it could make potentially a small difference in that regard. I think the bigger focus for things that he has said potentially in interviews or other pleadings could be really forensic details ultimately that contradict any version of events that he's given. Those could be potentially risky things that come out of interviews with either the press or even law enforcement.
All right, Nicole DeBoard, any last thoughts on this case?
It's a complicated one. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy, excuse me. And, looking at a death at the hands of someone who fired a firearm in the direction of another usually isn't quite so complicated. But here we have an individual who had really, truly no reason to believe that firearm was live and loaded with a live round.
Yeah, especially such a high profile case with such a high profile person involved. Will be interesting to watch moving forward. As we said, multiple wrongful death lawsuits filed against Alec Baldwin himself and the production company. So we'll see how those move forward. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.